Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll start today's proceedings and welcome you to this afternoon's Faraday Institute Research Seminar. My name is Keith Fox. I'm the director of the Faraday Institute, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Bethany Sollereder, who's going to be our speaker. So as I say, today's speaker is Bethany Sollereder, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, Bethany. Bethany originated from Canada, and she has a BA in Intercultural Studies from Vanguard College and a Master's in Interdisciplinary Studies from Regent College in Vancouver. She came across to the UK and did a PhD in Theology at the University of Exeter, working on the subject of evolutionary theodicy, and many people will be familiar with the things that she's written on that. She's presently working as a postdoctoral fellow in science and religion at the Laudato Si Research Institute in Oxford, and his work is on the theological possibilities and human vocation in the light of irreversible changes in ecological degradation. And it's along that subject that she'll be speaking to us today on the title of Theology Past the Tipping Point, God's Goodness in a World of Rapid Change. Bethany, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I am so glad to be here today. So let's begin. The world is changing rapidly. Despite the pandemic raging across our world, climate change remains the most pressing issue for human health and well-being. And that the climate is changing is not really news in one sense. So any geologist could tell you that the climate has changed many times, as you can see from a graph like this one. The Earth is estimated to have spent more time without polar ice caps than it has done with them. So massive amounts of climate change are part of the natural course of things. Notice that where we are now on the right hand of the graph is about halfway between the coldest temperatures in the last 500 million years and more or less the average. So we're in a reasonably cool period if you think, or if you look at the whole history of complex life on Earth. Now, the Earth has also spent significant amounts of time almost entirely covered with ice, the so-called snowball Earth, the last of which was just before the period in the previous graph. And the snowball Earth has only been escaped by means of tectonic plate activity, building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere until the greenhouse effect melted the global ice cover. Now, both extremely hot periods and the extremely cold periods resulted in mass extinction. So scientists estimate that 99% of all species that have ever existed have now gone extinct. Extreme climate change and the extinction that ensues are actually normal phenomena for this third rock from the sun, normal though not regular. This period is known, where we are now, as the Holocene. So when we're talking about the IPCC, talking about pre-industrial levels, they're really talking about these last 10,000 years after the last ice age, which you can see on the right side of this graph. But keep in mind that even the high temperature on a graph like this one is still rather cool when compared against much longer Earth history. Now, the important thing about the Holocene is that it is during this period, during this last 10, 11,000 years, that humans have significantly reshaped the Earth through agriculture and domestication. So while behaviorally modern humans have been around for about 50,000 years, it's during the Holocene with these rather stable temperatures that our ability to expand our population due to reliable and scalable food sources has really bloomed. Now, in this talk, I'm going to explore what it means theologically if we're past global climate tipping points, if we're leaving that Holocene stable behind, that sweet spot for human existence, as it were, and facing a new normal of ever rising temperatures. This is not yet a scientific certainty, but Professor Tim Lenton at Exeter University, in a paper published by Nature in 2019, argued, I quote, that the intervention time left to prevent tipping could already have shrunk toward zero, whereas the reaction time to achieve net zero emissions is 30 years at best, end quote. So he says that this change represents an existential threat to civilization and that we're in a state of planetary emergency. Other climate scientists agree. So Professor Christopher Scotes at Northwestern University says we're leaving our Ice Age heritage behind, and the time for decisive action is quickly slipping away. And even, mainstream media like the New York Times is warning that the changes are locked in. There's not a real way out of the warming, apart from some of what we'll talk about later. And it is animal life, including humans and large animals, that are most endangered by a warming climate. Particular plant species are also at risk, but not plants as a whole. And the majority of mammals are endangered because they depend so heavily on an extremely narrow slice of species for food. So if we think about humans, 75% of the global human food supply comes from only 12 crops and 5 livestock species. And our livestock species depend largely on just a few cereals and soy. And this leaves humans and human livestock extremely vulnerable to a rapidly changing climate, vulnerable to mass starvation and lack of fresh water, both to drink or to use in irrigation for our water-hungry crops, vulnerable in terms of where we've chosen to build major cities. We'll get onto that. Now, I'm not sure how much there will be that is really optimistic in this talk. As opposed to all things bright and beautiful, as Keith said, I do evolutionary theodicy, suffering, death, so I tend to focus on all things grim and depressing. But let's begin with a point of light. No matter how badly Earth temperatures rise in the coming centuries, we're not talking about the end of life on Earth. And this is because the vast majority of life on Earth is not human or even animal. So you can see on the left side, that's the carbon weight of life on Earth. And animals are just that tiny little group on the bottom right-hand side, that tiny little multicolored square. And of that, you can see that humans are only a very small proportion of even the animal world. So by weight, there's 35 times more bacteria than there is of all animal life combined. And humans and mammals compose just 0.067 gigatons of carbon, or 0.25% of all carbon life on Earth. So as Bill Bryson once sort of wryly noted, he says, bacteria may not build cities or have interesting social lives, but they will be here when the sun explodes. This is their planet, and we are on it only because they allow us to be. Now, he could easily have said the same about archaea and protists. Nor are we necessarily even talking about the extinction of humans in the coming centuries. So a research paper just published last month in Earth Science Reviews maps out the best estimates of global temperature during the development of complex life over the last 540 million years. And you can see where we are now on the far right-hand side at about 14, 15 degrees centigrade, and where they think anthropogenic warming will take us to around 19 degrees. Now that will be more than enough to melt the polar ice caps, which is the dotted line you'll see, but it will not cause a runaway spike the way that happened at the end of the Permian period, or even the slower climb into a hothouse of the mid-Cretaceous. So it will get much warmer than now, but we'll still be well below the average temperature over this entire period. So there is some good news. Not all is doom and gloom. Now, the bad news, of course, is that this is only accounting for anthropogenic climate change. If it gets compounded by other factors, a flood basalt flow leading to a large igneous province, for example, massive volcanic and sort of lava flows that can be nearly as big as continents, then we might be in much more trouble. That's what happens in the big spike at the end of the Permian there in the middle. The fact is, we are not in control of climate on Earth, despite all our technical know-how. And it's worth remembering that human existence is not inevitable. And that raises all sorts of theological questions. So we've been trained to think of humans as the pinnacle of creation, the end point of all previous species. And theologically speaking, this is in particular because of two doctrines. First, that humans are made in the image of God. And second, because of the incarnation, that God took on human flesh and dwelt among us, seems to give humans an exalted identity amongst animal life. Yet increasingly, scholarship is beginning to question how necessarily anthropomonic those two doctrines really are. Anthropomonism, by the way, is the idea that only humans matter. Well, anthropocentric is defined as having humans in a central place, but does not specifically entail humans being the only creatures that matter to God. So I will tend to use anthropomonism because it's more specific, but you could also just substitute in your brain, the bad kind of anthropocentrism, like when Immanuel Kant wrote, quote here, "As the single being on earth that possesses understanding, man is the titular lord of nature, and supposing that we regard nature as a teleological system, he is born to be its ultimate end," end quote. So that's the bad kind of anthropocentrism. That would be anthropomonism. Really, it's all about humans. So our question is, do the image of God and the incarnation indicate theologically that only humans are of value to God's creative purposes? So if humans were to go extinct or to diminish greatly as a population, is the story of creation over? The work of Ruth Page, Dennis Edwards, Jürgen Moltmann, Holmes Rolston, Elizabeth Johnson, Niels Gregerson, and many other contemporary theologians would argue no, it's not over. Well, most of these authors, Ruth Page might be an exception, would defend that humans have a uniquely important place in world history. They have been emphasizing the importance of animals and the non-human creation to God. And one example of this is the concept of deep incarnation, which was coined by Niels Gregerson. So deep incarnation is an attempt to expand the boundaries of where we see the importance of the identification of the particular life of Jesus of Nazareth with the wider world. So when Christ became Jesus of Nazareth, we don't see that as only of significance to Jews or to carpenters or to men. In God becoming human, all humans are represented by Christ. We're all happy with that. Humanity as a whole is ennobled by that act of God. Well, deep incarnation asks, why stop there? The Gospel of John does not say God became human and dwelt among us, but God became sarx. God became flesh. And traditionally, we've only bothered to spell out what it means that God became human, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. What we have not done is fully articulate what it means that God became flesh. Think of it, that God became mammal, or God became chordate, or God became animal, or if you really want to stretch it, that God became molecules of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, etc. And so deep incarnation allows us to see the unity that the incarnation offers not only to all humans, regardless of race or gender, but also to all life, and even possibly to all matter. So what could this mean for extreme climate change or climate disaster in the future? It could mean that even if humans and most animals go extinct, that the providential purposes of God can be remade and redeemed. The implications of salvation offered through the incarnation are not necessarily limited to the human species. So who is to say that God will not start a new phase of salvation history, through the future descendants of the octopus or of the remarkably intelligent slime mold. Now, I'm not implying that there would be another incarnation, because with the thinking of deep incarnation, God has already inhabited shared flesh with the cephalopod and the slime mold. Just as God did not need to become incarnate in every race or culture or gender, but came once for all, so I think God does not need to become incarnate in every species, but came once for all. Yet, in the Hebrew Bible, there are many theophanies where God is revealed to people in a form akin to the incarnation. So whether that's to Moses, who's set in the crag of the rock and sees Moses from behind, or to Abraham as the three strangers, you think of the Rublev icon, or to Jacob as the adversary at the ford of Jabbok. And so perhaps in this way, through various theophanies, God could be made present to those future species, just as God has been present in all Earth's history prior to Christ. So the incarnation does not actually require us to have an anthropomorphic view of the centrality of humans. God's creative interaction with the world could continue in a radically changed world. So what about the image of God? If we looked at the diverse interpretations of the image of God, we would actually struggle to find any kind of united definition. Indeed, looking over the whole span of interpretations, it's tempting to agree with Hendrikus Berkhoff's sort of comic observation that, quote, by studying how systematic theologies have poured meaning into Genesis 1:26, one could write a piece of Europe's cultural history, end quote. So exegetes coming to the image of God seem to have largely taken whatever supposedly essential attribute that they liked best about themselves and decided that that is what the image of God means. Now, scholarship has more recently moved away from the search for that singular and essential quality, whether it's rationality, morality, dominion, sensitivity to God, creativity, or so on. Instead, scholars have focused on relational or Christological interpretations of the Imago Dei. And these point either to the unique relationship God has chosen to have with humans, or to the idea that Christ is actually the only one fully made in the image of God, and that the rest of us are made in the image of God insofar as we're conformed to the likeness of Christ. Now, both of these interpretations do not suggest any reason for why the image of God needs to stop at the boundary marker of the human species. So just as God elected to have a particular relationship with humans, so God could call any species and elect to have a particular relationship with them. So as Joshua Moritz has pointed out, God's election of Israel was specifically because there was nothing at all special about them amongst the nations. They were not the most powerful, nor the most numerous, nor the most skilled. There's sort of an arbitrary nature about the choice. They were called because they were loved by God. So too, other species might be called in the future because of the love of God. And in terms of the Christological interpretation, that we're in the image of God insofar as we're conformed to Christ, there is again no particular need to stop at the human species. So insofar as the giant squid is or can be conformed to the likeness of Christ, it too could be considered to be made in the image of God. So this story of God's creation did not begin with humans. There's no necessary reason to believe that it will end with humans either. The oft-scandalous promiscuity of Jesus's love for everyone in the New Testament opens the door to exploring what the love of God means for those beyond the human community, and how the story of God might play out amongst populations that we either have no interaction with or who are in the far future long after we're gone. And in fact, work on what to do with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. I don't know how many of you watched the Mars rover land looking for evidence of life on other planets, but that the existence of extraterrestrial life poses many of the same problems. And I've been thinking about, the far future with the work of people like David Wilkinson in mind as I discuss this. So creation, far from being a static description of something that happened in the prehistoric past, describes God's ongoing work with the world. God is creating every day new possibilities, new relationships, and new redemptions. Now, I want to just sort of say, I'm not necessarily trying to argue for or against some of these speculations, nor for how far we ought to extend these concepts, but I would like to open up the question, how essential is the continuation or the ever-growing expansion of the human species for the ongoing work of God? So I've started with reflections on sort of a worst case scenario in the long distant future of dramatical ecological collapse of even all animal life. But what about in the short term? If we can be persuaded that the long-term purposes of God cannot be thwarted by our failure, how should we think about the short term? Now, I'm taking for granted, for the sake of this paper, that the changes in climate in terms of global warming are past the tipping point, that they're irreversible in the short term. And this is not yet proven, but it is well worth asking what it would be like if it does happen. What if the polar ice caps melt, the oceans swell, temperatures rise, and the crops we have relied on for thousands of years no longer grow as abundantly as they do now? What if the dwelling places of all those who live on the ocean's shores are inundated by the rising waves? What if there's mass migration out of nations that have become too hot for human habitation and mass starvation due to the failure of those staple crops on which we all rely? Well, let's start with some of the facts and projections that we are looking at right now. So currently global ice is melting at a rapidly increasing rate. Glaciers are disappearing. We could look, for example, in the United States at Glacier National Park. The 150 some glaciers that earned the park its name have dwindled to only 25 left. And those that remain have also significantly decreased in size. So you can see that in these two pictures of the Swift Current Glacier comparing 1910 to 2016. Ice at the polar caps is even more startling. So normally stoic scientists are now warning that the global ice is hemorrhaging. Ice melt from Greenland and the Arctic could increase sea levels by 3 to 7 feet by 2100. And if the West Antarctic shelf melted entirely, seas would rise by about 35 feet. And the East Antarctic ice shelf, which is much bigger, will take longer, likely centuries to melt, as it holds 4/5 of all ice on Earth. But if it does melt, as the projections of the anticipation of anthropogenic warming would anticipate, the eventual rise would be 216 feet. So most coastal cities would be underwater. London, New York, Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, Baghdad, Beijing, Hong Kong, Singapore, Mumbai, Kolkata, Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, all of those countries, or not all those countries, all of those cities would be lost under the waves. Even in less apocalyptic circumstances, the effects of climate change on human economics will be profound. So according to the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they quote, "The rise in tropospheric ozone has already reduced yields of wheat, rice, maize, and soybean by 3 to 16% globally," end quote. And we're looking at a change in those same crops by between 3 and 7% for every degree Celsius of increase in global mean temperature. Fisheries are also at risk, with rising sea levels and rising temperatures contributing to problems ranging from introduced species to various diseases to a dramatic lowering of the oceanic oxygen levels and rising acidification of the waters. Now, severe reductions in food production is also compounded by the risk of increased inequality of food distribution due to climate-related factors. It will mean that malnutrition and starvation will increase. And this is not in the far future. We're seeing these changes already. There are already climate refugees, and we could really be looking at significant changes by 2050. And all of those predictions are also only if you don't factor in how human conflict rises with the instability of the predicted increases in fires, flooding, lack of food, and population displacement. So this is from, oh, there we go, there's my flooding. This is one of the tables from that IPCC report. And it just shows how the risks increase as global temperatures increase. And not everything is necessarily terrible. So it shows that there's benefits for Arctic fisheries, for example, at the top. But as each degree of warming climbs, the risks for most things get worse. And the temperature in November 2020 was already a degree above the 20th century average. So we're already into that first column and quickly moving. So if we're past this tipping point and the mere restriction of carbon emissions or natural carbon capture, like planting more trees, will not stop climate change, then there are really two possible routes, ultimately speaking. Either attempting drastic interventions to try and stop the changes, or to try to adapt to a world whose changes in temperature will not likely stop at even 3 degrees, and the widespread extinction and change that that entails. Now, we might be able to slow down the pace of that change, but we would be admitting that the change is out of our control, and our focus would switch towards adapting both for ourselves and other species. Now, either one of these choices, whether we choose to try and do radical intervention or we try to adapt, has underpinning theological considerations and implications. So if we attempt drastic interventions like releasing aerosols in the high atmosphere to reflect the sun's incoming heat, or fertilizing the oceans to encourage carbon-hungry algae blooms, it presupposes a particularly strong sense of our human species' control over the biosphere. And it's undoubtedly the case that humans have already changed every ecosystem on Earth. But much of this was done without the knowledge that we really could affect the very fabric of global ecosystems. But to try and geoengineer the Earth through intentional planet-wide interventions would be to take a role in planetary history that is intentionally, self-consciously, one of dominion and control. So we could no longer pretend to be simple stewards of creation or act like that we're simply part of God's community of creation. And ever since Lynn White Jr. blamed Christian models of dominion for the environmental crisis in his landmark 1967 paper, theologians have been falling over themselves to emphasize the participatory and the non-coercive nature of the human role. So John Zizoulis, T.F. Torrance, and John Chrysavis emphasize that the human relationship to nature is one of priesthood. It's of self-sacrificial service and mediation of praise rather than one of control or dominion. Richard Bauckham insists that we must think of ourselves as a part of the community of creation, but certainly not its master. Anne Primavesi calls stewardship exploitative and unecological, while Claire Palmer condemns it as unbiblical. The exercise of human control over the natural world is not a popular choice amongst theologians. But paradoxically, if we take up the task of stopping the snowballing climate before it becomes an avalanche, or if we take drastic action to alter the course of that avalanche, sort of redirect the world ecological systems, then we have to be honest that we're standing over and above the course of all other life. Rosemary Radford Ruther actually accepts that and says, like it or not, if the diverse biota of the earth are to be protected and preserved, it will only be by the human community asserting an enlightened guardianship over it. Now, whether the human community is capable of sustained enlightened guardianship is another question over which a very large red flag ought to be waved. Our track record on this one is not good. Now I can hear some of you saying, okay, but Bethany, intervening at this point is only cleaning up what we have messed up. It's different. We're not trying to take control. We're just trying to sort out the mess we made. And okay, maybe, but arguably you could say that's worse. The first people who started to dig up coal in industrial amounts did not have the faintest clue that they could change the composition of the Earth's atmosphere or of the seemingly boundless oceans. But we would be striking out to cause a change at a global level without knowing whether or not it will work or if it will only make things worse. And it would also be a global policy of sort of mammals first or animals first. And we have to think whether that is appropriate. If, however, we choose to adapt to the changes to perhaps mitigate the worst case scenarios of widespread extinction, but largely to avoid radical steps to ensure our own survival or that of the species we rely on at the same levels we have now, then we have to have some really frank discussions about suffering, death, and even about the diminishment of the human species. And with these changes will inevitably come an immense amount of suffering, and we need to be able to encounter that, both personally and theologically. If creation is not uniquely about human existence, then perhaps we should be willing to embrace the decline of our own species. We might take the position of John the Baptist towards Jesus. He must increase and I must decrease. Other life must increase and we must decrease. And that leads us to reflect on the place of extinction, not only of us, but other animal species, other creatures who will die. So the death of every individual of a species is extinction. And so both death and extinction are normal, the eventual end of every life and every species. But just as the loss of an individual is the loss of a unique voice in the world, so the loss of a species leaves the world poorer. It's like losing an instrument section from an orchestra. A whole type of music becomes impossible in the symphony of creation. But how far should we resist it? Short of nuclear war, this is not a question that is on our immediate horizon, but it's worth asking how far we should prioritize mammalian survival, that mere 0.25% of life on Earth over all other life, or to what extent is that desire malignant? To what extent is it like the attempts of transhumanists to cheat death by living forever on silicone chips? Or like those who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to have their bodies cryogenically frozen at the point of death in the hopes that they will be revived in 100 years' time by advanced medicine. My question is, to what extent would it be similar for us to take radical actions towards stabilizing global climate when, looked at over the course of Earth's history, the climate is not naturally stable? Perhaps we should simply embrace the changing, given that human action has really only hastened a change in climate that would have been inevitable in the long run at some point. It probably would have immediately gone back into a glacial age, but eventually we would have had processes that would warm the Earth. Now, alternatively, we might argue that, hey, you know what, humans, we are co-creators with God. And creating an artificially stable climate for the benefit of so many creatures is actually part of our calling. We should see this up and down of stabilize out because of human work. So Philip Hefner's phrase has been used in the work of Ted Peters and others to suggest that we should not merely steward the natural course of things, but that humans are right to use their creativity and their unprecedented power to create a new state of things that combines human and natural creativity, human and divine creativity. So you could look at the broad scope of the Bible. God begins by making a garden for people to dwell in, yet after expulsion, Cain founds a city. Cities are not part of God's creative remit, but they're the work of human hands. Yet, in the final eschatological image in the book of Revelation, The heavenly Jerusalem is described as a garden city, a melding of those two types of dwelling place, the creativity of God and of human hands combined. So if the stable temperatures of the Holocene would normally have changed in 10,000, 20,000 years, they still would have changed. But perhaps finding ways to maintain this temperature for far longer is the global equivalent to city building, a global example of niche construction, or perhaps, as Chris Southgate has suggested, our task may be to eliminate the existence of extinction altogether, human and non-human. But that could only be achieved through utter mastery of Earth conditions and things like climate change. So here's the rub. I don't know, nor can I tell you which is the right way to go. Radical attempts to try to stop climate change may themselves have radical and unintended consequences. Fertilizing the oceans could throw off the ocean's ecosystems in the same way that our land fertilizers have become a poison to rivers and lakes, whilst ultimately depleting the soil. High atmosphere aerosols, while cooling the earth, will also block the light that is life-giving to plants, just to name two possible outcomes. Would preventing extinction in fact prevent the development of future species, thus robbing Earth's history of potential richness due to our reluctance to change? And if we're not wise enough to understand all the consequences of our actions, are we really wise enough to attempt major interventions in the first place? What is clear is that whichever way we choose, whether radical intervention or active adaptation, the consequences will be far-reaching and globally felt, and very few of those who will literally suffer the consequences will have any part in the decision-making process. So I've talked throughout this lecture about a number of themes, from reinterpretations of the image of God and the doctrine of the incarnation, and how those might reframe a change from the Holocene to a new world ecosystem, to two possible roles humans can play: the radical intervention of dominion, or acceptance and adaptation in a climate that is tipping over the edge of change after a rough 10,000 years of stability. So as befits a lecture on a topic where there is so much uncertainty, there are plenty of loose ends, plenty of unexplored paths, and I hope that we can explore those together in the Q&A. But for now, let me thank you for your time and your attention.
Bethany, thank you ever so much for that talk. There's already quite a number of questions that have come in, and I'll see if I can articulate those in the way that the questioner intends. A few of them, if you like, more environmental, and some of them more theological in nature. Let me start with one of the more theological ones. What about the Christian doctrine that Jesus will return and creation will be transformed into a new creation, and that all humans and animals as well will be resurrected into this new creation? How does that fit in with what you're thinking?
That's really interesting. So, as people will not be surprised to hear, there's a variety of different views on this. So we could, and I'm not going to talk about sort of rapture theology in the sort of dispensationalist way, but we could see the new creation as something that does happen in the course of regular Earth history, or rather as something that wraps up Earth history. And that's been a debate all the way back in church history. So I was recently reading Augustine's City of God, and realized that although he thought humans were created immortal, created perfect in all the right ways, he didn't think, sorry, that they were created immortal. He thought that they were conditionally immortal based on their being able to continually eat from the tree of life, but that God didn't cause them to die by kicking them out. He just took away their source of ongoing ability. But at that point, they still needed to eat and drink and do all the regular things bodies need to do. But he thought at some point there would be a switch from that to some new way of being, where they would be quickened by the Spirit in such a way that they wouldn't need to do things like eat and drink and so on. So even in the sort of highest form of Augustine's thought, he's still saying there needs to be some radical change for the promises of heaven to be good things, because eternal life in a body as we have it is not a good thing. It would be really, really detrimental if we just kept living on and on and on exactly as we're composed now. But how and where that will happen has always been debated. So I think while we look forward to the return of Christ, in the meantime, we've got to be open to the anticipation that God will let the history of life roll out until the sun explodes, and will recreate out of what is in the end the natural outplaying of Earth's history.
Yeah, so if you like, God created from chaos. So it didn't start with Eden, it was from chaos to order. Is there the chance that everything would then ultimately end up in chaos again?
Well, I think if we look, barring some large intervention, that again itself would so radically change things. If things follow the natural course that we can tell, they will end up either in a big crunch or in the heat death of the universe, looking forward. But even for the future of our little planet, in that global scheme, the sun is going to grow enough that it will swallow the earth, and that will be the end of life on this earth. And that is looking to the very far future. But even things, I mean, I mentioned large igneous provinces, and if we have one of these major events like what happened at the end of the Permian, it would be game over for humans on this earth. So there's a lot, or a big enough meteor strike, or there are many things that could cause existential change to the planet, which would make climate change seem small by comparison. So I do think that things will end in chaos in that way, but that there will be recreation on a different set of principles of life.
Thank you. Maybe I can switch tack a little bit to going back to your idea of deep incarnation. And one of the questioners has asked, is there anything, is that really a new idea? Did the early church fathers know about? Did they make, well, they didn't make connections between species in the same way that we do. They had a remarkably profound insight into the universal implications of the incarnation and the resurrection. Is that actually the more traditional view?
That's difficult to say. I'm not a patristic expert. But I mean, you can read things in Paul, for example, that all things are reconciled through Christ, in Colossians and, in pieces of Romans. And so if you're thinking of all things, both in heaven and on earth, being reconciled through Christ, that certainly opens the door to a wider view of the incarnation's implications than has generally been held. But there are some thinkers who were profoundly anthropocentric throughout Christian history, and I think that particularly in the Western Protestant tradition, those voices have prevailed.
Thank you. And maybe to pick up the idea of incarnation, could God really become incarnate in anything which is not, as somebody has put it, a rational corporal being?
Well, the honest answer to that is I don't know, but I presume so. I think that our species has a particular love affair with rationality, as if this is the primary attribute of God, but I don't think rationality, but love is the primary attribute of God. So I think God could not be incarnate in any creature who could not love, but non-rational, I'm less wedded to that as a term. So I do think that, you know, non-corporeal, I think again would pose certain. This is an interesting question, not one I've dealt with before, but I do think that would pose problems, but because the very word incarnate means sort of in incorporeal, or like in corporal form. But can God have theophanies? Can God be present on earth in other ways? Absolutely, both through the work of the Holy Spirit, but also I sort of pointed in my lecture to those places where God seems to have appeared in person in the Old Testament, but it wasn't a proper incarnation. Make of them what you will.
So the phrase is the word that became flesh, and that suggests some communication beyond just if like a loving feeling and a caring for, but a communication. Does that almost rely on something human-like in rationality?
That's a tricky question. If you base your definition of understanding around rationality, then yes, it would. But I think that there are other types of understanding that don't rely so deeply on rationality. And I mean, it comes back to sort of Thomas Nagel's question: what is it like to be a bat? We have no clue what kind of communication is relevant to a bat or a worm or a bacteria. And so presumably God does, and God does communicate to them in ways that are relevant to their ways of understanding. So I don't think we need to be quite so tied to the rational as we are. God has simply used that because that's the way to communicate to humans.
Yes, I don't know how you'd communicate with a bacterium.
I don't know either. No. But, you know, I mean, I have some trouble communicating with my cat, but we're getting to learn to understand each other. And it's mostly not, you know, it's starting to think more in terms of sense, more in terms of sounds, more in terms, you know, so trying to think in different ways so that I can communicate to my cat, not rationally, but through what lives in his mind. So I think God could do the same, and whether a bacteria can understand, I don't know. But if there is a method, I'm sure God would use it.
Speculation, I think, but yes.
Absolutely.
So let me read this question. Thanks you for an excellent talk. It seems to me of a specific human problem because of our consciousness of the events taking place. To fix the human problems, we need to look beyond ourselves. What does this insecurity mean for working towards a more just world for all?
Well, as I hinted at the end, I think we'll need to make really difficult decisions where the good of humans and the good of other creatures at least seem to conflict. And I ultimately they don't, because human survival and human flourishing relies upon the well-being of other creatures. We are not autotrophs. We can't exist on our own or anything close like it. So we need all these other things, but we may have to make great short-term sacrifices in preference of other creatures in order to be able to flourish alongside them. And so I think the notion of kenosis in our ethics, the idea of pouring ourselves out for the sake of others as Christ demonstrated, will become increasingly important. If you look at human history, there's not many places where you can look at sort of large scale kenotic action of humans as a species. That's not something we do well. You might be able to point to something like the abolition of slavery, but talk to a historian and they'll say, well, the market forces had changed so much that that was the expedient thing to do anyway. So everybody only changed when it was largely in their own self-interest to do so. And so I think that we're really in a place of deep challenge where we're being asked to transcend uh, the usual human course of things and do something radically different that would allow us to come through this period with a hope of flourishing and justice for all.
And I wondered if, in part, you were arguing against an interventionist approach of almost let things take their course. And the question is asking how that ties in with Christian responsibility. Climate change will affect the poor much more than the richer nations. And that surely is not acceptable to Christians.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not acceptable at all. And so I think so. What I would worry is that if we try and do the radical interventions, which tend to rely on certain types of technology that are only available to a very small percentage of the world in the first place, you have a few people making decisions for the global future of all the rest. And I think that that is problematic. But I also think that the longer we are distracted by the possibility of those, the less we're going to do the right thing here and now as going forward. So I think that we should. I leave it open ultimately, but I think that at the very least we should be working actively towards adaptation, which means making room, building houses, getting ready for climate refugees, and changing political policies about immigration to ease the travel of people whose homes are going to be completely destroyed because of the greed of particularly Western developed nations.
You understandably critiqued the whole concept of human dominion and the Lynn White approach to that. Let me read your question here. Is why does human responsibility towards creation stewardship have to mean dominion? Can it not just mean responsibility as divinely directed for humans in God's creation? Children in family have responsibility, but they don't have dominion.
Yeah, and that's very fair, but that would lead you down the path of adaptation, right? So yeah, so we can absolutely say, well, we're the children in the family, we've done some wrong, we can try and make that right, but that would preclude options like radical geoengineering to ensure a steady climate. That's not the kind of thing that we could do without a view of dominion. So, well, I support rejecting dominion. That also means accepting that we might be past the climate tipping point and we should be working towards that end.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question that maybe relates to also your experience and your thoughts on theodicy. It says your big picture theodicy does not help us come to terms with individual suffering and with a God who created a world in which suffering is inevitable. Do you have a more personal theodicy that will help us with these issues?
Yes. I mean, more personal theodicy. So I've written 2 books on theodicy, so that wasn't the nature of this talk now. But in terms of animal suffering in particular, I've got a book, God, Evolution, and Animal Suffering, Theodicy Without a Fall, which really does say the level of personal individual suffering is the most important question we can ask, because it's all too easy to say, well, it's for the greater good, whatever horrific suffering that goes on, well, it's got some greater good that we can do. And I reject that. I go with people like Marilyn McCord Adams or Eleanor Stump, who sort of say suffering has to have redemption in the life of an individual, or your theodicy has nothing good going for it. So I have developed that other places, and I think that is crucial. Yeah. The other book, well, so the other book that I've just written that will come out in August is called Why Is There Suffering? A pick your own theological expedition. And I've written it as a choose your own adventure style book, where you read a few pages and then you're faced with a theological decision. Is God good? Does God not exist? Is God powerful but doesn't care? And then you flip to different pages of the book depending on what you choose, and you follow on from there. So the attempt of that is to say, I don't want to stand as the theologian, as the expert who can explain suffering in your life. I don't think I can do that. There's so many reasons we can suffer, and there's so many different solutions that many of which are viable, and many of which would apply to different situations. So I've tried to create a tool where people can work out what they think with the tools that are out there provided by theodicists. So I'm happy to talk about what I find is a plausible theodicy. I'm less likely to say this is what you should take.
Going back to the whole question of intervention, if we have the tools to intervene, is it really our moral responsibility then to use them so as to intervene? And would a non-interventionist technique therefore be immoral?
Yeah. That's been hugely debated, and it's particularly debated by wildlife rangers and that sort of thing in national parks. So there are places where, for example, we have vaccines that we could give to wild populations, and there's been strong arguments that we should give them, vaccines. But at the same time, that means that they are now reliant upon human intervention, become reliant on human intervention in a way that they wouldn't naturally be. And the problem is many of these ethics really are situational. So you want to go in and see the situation and make a decision there rather than have a global answer to that, because the right thing to do in any one situation will differ depending on whether you're rural, urban, wilderness as much as it exists these days, and so on. So there's not a clear answer to that, but I for deep wilderness, I'm going to argue more for a non-interventionist when it comes to, say, farms or other places. I'm going to say yes, intervene, and then work that out in the middle in places like England, where there's neither wilderness nor.
Thank you. Our time is nearly up. Let me give you one short question that's a matter of speculation, and you don't have to give a long answer, and it's topical. So the question asks, can you envisage mankind living on Mars or another planet within our solar system because we've used up all the resources on Earth?
No, our technology is nowhere near where we would need. Every attempt to create a biome that would live alone on its own has failed spectacularly. You can go to some of these Eden projects, or there's a big thing in Arizona. So I'm with the people who say there is no planet B. We have no idea how to create an ecological system that would sustain human, let alone a human. So I think that's science fiction distraction from the work we really ought to be doing.
Thank you. It's nice to end on a bit of speculation and science fiction. Can I close the proceedings there? Thank you, Bethany, for stimulating our thinking. You can see from the number of questions, and we've only dealt with a fraction of them, that you've caused people to think, which is what these seminars are all about. So thank you ever so much for stimulating us today. I'll close the proceedings there. I'll say thank you to everybody for attending. Do come along next week as well, join in the activities of the Faraday Institute. And thank you ever so much again, Bethany, for stimulating our thinking today. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.